The telephone rang at 11 minutes past noon, Pacific time. I remember the hour exactly because I had just looked at my watch, wondering when they would call lunch on the set. I answered, and a voice I did not recognize said my name. Then nothing, just breathing. Then the line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver, and something in my chest tightened without reason. You know the feeling. When the air in a room changes before anyone has spoken. When your body understands what your mind has not yet been told. The assistant director came through the soundstage door less than a minute later. His face told me everything. He was pale. His hands were shaking. He opened his mouth twice before words came out. The president had been shot in Dallas. I set the receiver down very slowly. Around me, the set for Captain Newman continued to exist. The fake hospital walls. The prop medical equipment. The lights positioned for a scene we would never shoot that day. None of it seemed real anymore. None of it seemed to matter. Someone turned on a radio. We gathered around it like refugees around a fire. 15, then 20 of us. Grips and electricians and wardrobe people and actors still wearing makeup from the morning's work. We stood in silence and listened to a nation learn that its leader was dying. At 12:30, the announcement came. President Kennedy was dead. A woman near me began to cry. A man I had worked with for 3 weeks walked away without a word and did not come back. The rest of us simply stood there, frozen, uncertain what to do with our hands, our faces, our suddenly purposeless afternoon. I remember looking at the faces around me. Young men who had voted for Kennedy with hope in their eyes. Older men who had disagreed with him but now stood with their heads bowed. Women clutching each other's arms. All of us stranded together in that artificial hospital, surrounded by props and cables, while the real world outside bled. A grip named Danny, a man I had shared coffee with every morning for weeks, sat down on an apple box and put his head in his hands. He had a photograph of Kennedy in his wallet. I had seen it once when he paid for lunch. Now he sat there, shoulders shaking, and no one knew what to say to him. The studio executive arrived within the hour. A man whose name I will not mention because his sins were the ordinary sins of commerce, not of malice. He gathered the department heads near the craft services table and spoke in low, urgent tones. I was not part of that conversation, but I could see his hands moving, calculating, assessing. He approached me shortly after. "We need to discuss the evening," he said. I looked at him and waited. "The industry gala," he continued. "The one at the Ambassador. You are scheduled to present an award. The planning committee has decided the event should proceed. A show of strength. A demonstration that the nation will not be paralyzed by this tragedy." I said nothing. "They feel your presence would be particularly valuable," he continued. "A calming influence. A voice of steadiness. People trust you. They need to see familiar faces tonight." I looked past him, toward the soundstage door. Outside, somewhere in this city, in every city, people were sitting in front of television sets, watching the same footage repeat itself. The motorcade. The sudden chaos. The faces of witnesses who could not believe what they had seen. "No," I said. He blinked. I do not think he had anticipated resistance. "The committee has already announced the event will continue," he said. "Cancellation at this point would create its own kind of disruption. The tickets have been sold. The arrangements have been made. Then let it be disrupted." He started to speak again, and I held up my hand, not in anger. I was not angry. I was something else entirely, something I did not yet have a name for. "Listen to me," I said. "There are children in this country who watched their father leave for work this morning and learned 2 hours ago that he was murdered. There are families sitting together right now trying to find words for something that has no words. And you want me to stand at a podium tonight in a tuxedo and hand someone a statue while people applaud He started to say something about duty, about showing the world that America carries on, about the importance of not surrendering to despair, about professionalism and obligation and all the words that men use when they want to avoid feeling what they ought to feel. I let him finish. Then I said something I had been thinking since the moment I heard the news. Not everyone in this country loved John Kennedy. You know that as well as I do. Half the nation disagreed with him. Some hated him. Some celebrated when they heard what happened in Dallas. I know that. I am not naive. I paused. Let the words settle. But in his final year, he chose a side. He stood in front of the American people and said that civil rights was a moral issue, that it was as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. He put his presidency on the line for something he believed was right. And today, someone put a bullet in his head for it. The executive started to protest that we did not know why the shooting had happened, that it was too early to draw conclusions. That speculation was irresponsible. I cut him off. I am not making a political statement. I am making a human one. A man is dead. His wife watched him die. His children will grow up without him. And tonight, the decent thing to do is to stop. Just stop. For one evening, let people grieve without asking them to pretend that everything is fine. He looked at me for a long moment. His face shifted through several expressions: frustration, calculation, and finally, something that might have been understanding. Then he nodded once and walked away. I did not know if the gala would proceed without me. I did not know if my absence would matter at all, but I knew I could not stand on that stage and smile and shake hands while the country was bleeding. I drove home through streets that felt emptier than they should have been at that hour. Traffic moved slowly. People walked with their heads down. The afternoon light seemed wrong somehow, too bright for what had happened, too ordinary for a day that had broken the world in half. In front of one church, I saw a line forming, people waiting to go inside, to pray, I supposed, or simply to be somewhere that felt sacred, somewhere that acknowledged the weight of what we had all just witnessed. My wife met me at the door. Her eyes were red. She had been watching television all afternoon. The images, she said. The same images, over and over. Jackie in the pink suit. The Secret Service agent climbing onto the car. The crowd scattering. She had watched it so many times that it no longer seemed real. It had become a loop, a nightmare that would not end. She told me the children had been asking questions she could not answer. How do you explain to a child that the world contains this kind of darkness? How do you tell them that sometimes the good are struck down and the reasons never make sense? I held her for a long time without speaking. Sometimes there are no words. Sometimes presence is the only language that matters. That evening, the telephone rang again. This time I recognized the voice. Henry Fonda. We had known each other for years, worked together, disagreed about politics often enough, but always with respect, always as friends. Are you going to the ambassador? He asked. No. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, people want to hear something tonight. They want someone to tell them it is going to be all right. I know, I said, but I cannot tell them that, because I do not know if it is true. Another silence. Then Henry said something that surprised me. Maybe that is exactly what they need to hear. I did not understand what he meant. Not at first. He explained. Everyone is going to tell them to be strong, he said. Everyone is going to say the nation will endure. But maybe what people really need tonight is someone who admits that this is terrible, that it hurts, that we do not know what happens next. Someone who tells the truth about how bad this is, instead of rushing to make it smaller. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Around 8 o'clock, There was a knock at my door. A man from one of the networks. He said they were putting together a brief program. Not entertainment, not celebration, just a few voices. People the public trusted. Speaking directly to the nation. Would I be willing to say something? I almost refused. I had spent the afternoon convincing myself that silence was the appropriate response, that the decent thing was to step back and let the nation grieve without interference. But then I thought about what Henry had said, about truth, about the permission that comes from hearing someone else admit that they are struggling too. I asked the man what he wanted me to say. Whatever you feel, he said. Whatever seems right to you. I went. I sat in a studio that smelled of cigarette smoke and nervous sweat, surrounded by technicians who had probably not slept in hours. The cameras rolled, and I looked into the lens and spoke to the country. I did not give a speech. I did not make grand statements about the American spirit or the resilience of democracy. I spoke as a man, as a father, as someone who had watched the same terrible footage everyone else had watched, and felt the same helpless sorrow. I told them that I did not have answers, that I did not know why this had happened or what it meant for the future. I told them that it was all right to be afraid, all right to be angry, all right to feel like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. I told them that tonight was not a night for pretending. Tonight was a night for sitting with the people you loved and holding them close, for looking at your children and being grateful they were safe, for calling the friend you had not spoken to in too long and saying the words you had been meaning to say. I told them that John Kennedy, whatever you thought of his politics, had asked this country to do hard things, to serve, to sacrifice, to believe that we could be better than we were, and that the best way to honor him was not with statues or speeches, but by actually trying to become the nation he challenged us to become. I finished speaking. The red light on the camera went dark, and I sat there in the silence, wondering if I had said too much or not enough, or exactly the wrong thing. The technicians did not applaud. They did not offer congratulations. One of them, a young man with tired eyes, simply nodded at me, the kind of nod that says, "That was honest. Thank you." I drove home again through those same quiet streets. The church I had passed earlier still had its lights on. People were still inside, still searching for something that could hold the weight of this day. My wife was asleep when I arrived. I did not wake her. I sat in the living room with the television turned low, watching the same images repeat themselves into the small hours of the morning. I thought about the children who would grow up without a father. Caroline was 6 years old. John was not yet 3. They would have photographs. They would have stories told by others. But they would not have him. They would not have his voice reading to them at bedtime, his hand steadying them as they learned to ride a bicycle, his presence at graduations and weddings, and all the ordinary moments that make a life. I thought about the widow who would have to find a way to keep living, about the country that would wake up tomorrow and have to decide what kind of nation it wanted to be. Not everyone loved Kennedy. I knew that then, and I know it now. He was a politician, with a politician's compromises and a politician's flaws. But he had asked us to look at our neighbors and see fellow citizens instead of enemies. He had stood in the doorway of history and pointed towards something better, and now he was gone, killed by hatred or madness, or some combination of both. I never learned whether my words that night made any difference to anyone. I never received letters saying I had helped someone through that terrible weekend. Perhaps no one was listening. Perhaps they were all too lost in their own grief to hear. But I will tell you what I understood. Sitting alone in that living room, while the nation slept fitfully around me, I understood that silence is sometimes cowardice, dressed up as dignity. That there are moments when the world needs to hear another human voice. Not because that voice has answers, but because it proves that someone else is awake. Someone else is watching. Someone else refuses to look away. That is what I remember most about November 22nd, 1963. Not the shot that killed a president. Not the footage that played endlessly on every screen in America. But the moment I realized that showing up is sometimes the only moral choice available. The moment I understood that in times of darkness, the least we owe each other is the truth about how dark it is. And perhaps, if we are honest enough and brave enough, a single candle to prove that the darkness has not won. Not yet. Not while any of us still has breath to speak.